Hello again, everybody. Dr. Lee Coleman, returning for our series of discussions about psychiatry and society. We just finished up several sessions going a little deeper into psychiatry's medicalization of what it does with patients. I want to move to another focus. And it's a focus that I'm moving to because my career moved in a direction towards the subjects you're going to hear about in just a moment. And it wasn't anything that I could have ever anticipated. It wasn't anything that I was deciding I want to work in this area. Like virtually all the areas that I have worked in, there are things that were brought to me because of some awareness in the community of the positions that I held about psychiatry. Specifically, I had decided very early on in my career in the early 70s that I did not think involuntary treatment of patients was good for them or good for society. I didn't think it really helped people. It might control people, it might settle down something for a while, but I didn't think it was a good policy. And I refused to do it. I had to alter what I would do and what I wouldn't do in order to keep making a living. So I was no longer involved in any work at the county mental health system, which I had been involved in, where there is involuntary treatment. The patients that I was seeing knew that under no circumstances would they ever be forced into treatment in any way. It was always because they wanted it. So let me tell you kind of the nature of my work up until through 1984. I first started working in the San Francisco Bay Area in 1971, and then continuing until 1984. And by that time, I had a small private practice. It was done right here in my home. I think I've mentioned once before, the living room, which is where we're doing this filming, was the waiting room. And another room, which was supposed to be a bedroom, was used as the therapy room. Okay? And I never had what you call a large practice because I wasn't generating a lot of expenses. You don't need you don't need rooms for nurses and so forth. If you're a talking therapist, you might say, a psychiatrist who believes that the relationship and the content of the person's problems emerge and they work on it in that kind of context, 12, maybe 15 hours a week was the most that I ever did. And then in addition, I was involved in a variety of other issues had to do with the social and legal side, the kind of things that we're talking about in this series of talks. We're calling it Psychiatry and Society. First, I'd been involved in some issues having to do with prisoners and the role of mental health practitioners in that setting, juvenile justice system, a variety of other topics which we are going to get into in the future, but having to do with proposed research with prisoners and mental patients and so forth. That was my work. And then one other area which I have already talked about in some of these sessions was the role of psychiatry in testimony in criminal cases. You remember we talked about the insanity defense, talked about the diminished capacity defense, questions of competency for trial, and predicting dangerousness in the context of criminal justice. Is somebody ready to be released or not? So I was doing clinical work with patients and then engaged in quite a bit of media work, radio and television programs, writing articles, and advocacy, going to the legislature in Sacramento, working with other people who were of similar opinions, trying to influence some social policies on those same issues. So if we narrow it down to my work in the criminal courts, I want to explain a little more about that. Some of it will be a repeat from previous, but that's okay. This is a learning process, I hope, for you and for me. So in the work, just to refresh your memory, in the work that I was doing in the criminal courts, I was going to court to testify in many, many cases. Now, if you've been paying attention, you might be wondering, well, Dr. Coleman, if you don't really think much of these psychiatric examinations, why are you yourself going to court and testifying? And believe me, attorneys opposing me in those cases certainly asked me to justify that. The answer to the question is that while I was going to court, I was never giving opinions about the state of anybody's mind. Did they know what they were doing was wrong? Would they be dangerous in the future? Do they understand enough to be able to be competent to go for trial? What I was always doing would be like a counterpuncher in boxing. I was responding to what the other side's experts had already said, and then by studying their reports and the material of the case, explaining to a jury why those methods really could not do what the law expects them to do. What the law expects them to do is have special tools that ordinary lay people don't have, and form opinions with those tools, which therefore might assist the people who will decide the case, the jury, or in some cases a judge. So I was giving testimony, but my testimony was always about the state of psychiatry, not about the state of anybody's mind. So that's what I was doing, testifying then for the prosecution in almost every case, in criminal cases, because it was the defense which was hiring the experts to talk about insanity, diminished capacity, or predictions, and so forth. So far, that's all a review of what we had before. Now something new came along. What came along was a new kind of case that I didn't know, I had never worked in before. But a defense attorney who knew what I did in the cases in which they were on the opposing side, they knew that I didn't think psychiatry's examinations were reliable, that I didn't think they were scientific, that they didn't deserve any weight. And I began to get, after this first case, a number of other cases where people were saying, Dr. Coleman, we know of your work, we know what your perspective is. We have a case where now it's the prosecution which is bringing in mental health professionals, giving opinions about whether a child has been molested, sexually molested. That's what we're going to talk about for a next series of sessions, because gradually, without any planning of mine, I became more and more inundated with those kind of cases, because what I saw was truly shocking. And we've already done 4 sessions on one of the most well-known and illustrative cases, the McMartin preschool case. So we're going to do a series of sessions talking about not just that, other kind of cases like that, but we're going to go deeper, just like we did with psychiatry and its drugs and its medical model and so forth. We're now going to go much, much deeper into that topic. Here is the way I would frame it. It's how do we as a society use our agencies to handle the problem of justice and the fact that children do get sexually abused. How do we find out what is the truth? How do we help children who have been abused? How do we find out if, in fact, the person accused has not abused the child? How do we find out if maybe nobody's abused the child sexually, but maybe some people have abused the child in other ways, which has caused them to say the things that they are saying now? That's what we're going to do. Before we can do that, before you can do your best job of forming your opinion about what I'm saying, because again, I'm not asking you to believe anything because I'm saying it. Don't be taken by my credentials or any of that. Take the information, plug it into your mind, your experience, and make up your mind. But before you can do that, I want to try to touch on one more preliminary issue. and then we'll take a break until the next session. And that is, I want to take up this subject of whether, for some reason, I'm not able to take a fair and honest look at this topic of whether a child's been sexually abused. Of course, the attorneys have their standard way of attacking me, and you might be tempted to fall into some of those traps. Like you might say, well, gee, you must make a lot of money when you go to court. Or, gee, you know, why is it that you're not sympathetic to children who've been abused? Do you have some reason why you've testified so many times for the defense, but you never testify for the prosecution? All those kind of subjects. So I want to say a little bit about my background, my work, and where I stand on these things. I really don't feel personally a need to defend myself because I've done it so many times, but I know from experience people have these questions. It's a very, very emotional topic. The first thing I want to say is, please think hard about the subject of whether or not somebody who wants to really take a good look at this topic, whether there's a connection between caring about children. There's a lot of people who are critical of what I say in court and other places, who think that there's a direct connection between, say, becoming convinced in a particular case that the evidence doesn't really indicate that it happened, that the child really was molested, that somehow that's related to whether you care about children, whether or not you want to see children protected. I would just say that if you care enough about what I think, please investigate my career. Read my articles. Read my 2 books. The Reign of Error, Psychiatry, Authority, and Law, that I published in 1984. And the book that I published with Patrick Clancy, an attorney, in 1997, I believe it was. Maybe a year later, I don't remember, with attorney Patrick Clancy and myself, called Has a Child Been Molested? Everything about my career will demonstrate that I have focused on helping segments of society which are not able to protect themselves, to keep them from being abused, specifically by the mental health system, or the mental health system in collaboration with the legal system. Whether it's children, whether it's mentally troubled people, prisoners, the elderly, women, every group, I have done work which is related to helping them gain greater protection. My work in this area is just one more of those areas where, unfortunately, we have a system where children are being abused in a way that I'm aware of, never before. Many, many children are being abused by the very people who are being paid to protect them. Child protection social workers, mental health professionals, various kinds of therapists. And of course, I'm not accusing them of intending to harm children, but I'm sorry, that's not good enough. What we have to be interested in is what people actually do. So, as you listen to this rather lengthy series of talks that we're going to have about this subject, keep in mind the name of the game here is 2 things. A society that protects children from abuse of all kinds. That includes sexual abuse, physical abuse, or abuse by professionals who are labeled as child protection helping people, but in fact, in my judgment, are doing things which are abusing children. So next time we're going to start off with some more history. We're going to look back at where the child protection movement came from with regard to sexual abuse of children, where it got off track, and leading up, it'll take us 2 or 3 sessions to get there, leading up to how the system is currently abusing children regularly and sending innocent people to prison. All the while because of those things, doing a lousy job of finding out when it really has happened, so that the criminal justice system can take to serve its function punishment for those who are guilty of crimes. That's what it's for. Okay? Please come back, and we'll keep digging into this. Thanks for coming.